Good afternoon, and welcome to the Humanistic Design Speaker Series, brought to you by the Ecology Center. I want to thank them so much for offering this series. Also, I'd like to thank the college staff who helped put it together. I actually don't put anything together. They do all the work. They do the advertising. They do the setup. They do it all. They do arranging. I show up and get to introduce smart people, which is a great job. And they make this the enjoyable experience that it is. This is part of a series at Keller that we've been doing, and the series itself is part of a plan to help grow humanistic design here at Princeton. And if you don't know or are not aware, Keller has been trying to grow design on this campus over the last 10 years. Right now, in the spring, Keller is offering at least 6 courses in humanistic design studies. Plus, we offer design as part of other Keller services, like the program for faculty focused on design for innovation. And next year, the James Wade professor will be Carl DeSalvo, who is a designer out of Georgia Tech. I am Ken Anderson, the James Wade professor this year, by the way. The spring series that we've been doing, I don't know if you've made any of the other talks, has been emphasizing that humanistic design is not just a co-curricular activity, it's not just a supporting activity, it is actually a knowledge production activity. And makes substantive contributions to the academy, not just a helper discipline. In that context, this afternoon, I'm delighted to have Shannon Mattern here. Shannon is a Penn Presidential Compact Professor of Media Studies and Art History at University of Pennsylvania. Prior to that, she was at the School of New Media Studies and the Department of Anthropology at the New School and Parsons. She has won the New School's Distinguished Universities Teacher Award. More importantly for us, for me anyway, this part of the thing, is that her writing and teaching has focused on archives, libraries, and other media spaces, media infrastructures, and sites where data and art intersect. She is the author of a book called The New Downtown Library, Designing with Communities. And again, her topic today will be about libraries, but in that particular book, in that monograph, she highlights both the multidimensional use of the space, as well as the social forces that create the place for public life. She's also written about, she also has a book out called Deep Mapping the Media City, Code and Clay, Dirt and Dirt, 5,000 Years of Urban Media. All those are published by University of Minnesota Press. She has wisely switched to Princeton University Press for her latest book called A City is Not a Computer. This new book was particularly of interest to me because I had worked at Intel prior to coming here, where smart cities were the focus of much of our work for a decade. And unfortunately, we didn't have this book to help us out. They can have it now that I've gone. The book presents a new frame for smart cities. And for me, this is an important shift. That part of what design does is not just make things, but can make frames for thinking that then impact how things get built. And for industries like tech ones, it's hugely important. In particular, I lost the frame she gives in this book as one that doesn't limit cities to efficiencies. That there are other models that we can use to show that cities are a myriad of local and indigenous intelligences and knowledge institutions. The other place that I've run into Shannon's work has been the Places Journal. In particular there, she's written for my interest around repair, which also was another break in the design tradition from a decade ago, where repair becomes an important part of thinking about design and what design can do rather than just producing end products. Finally, I will mention that she was on the board for the Metropolitan New York Library Council, and she also regularly creates public design as well as other kinds of projects and exhibitions there. Today she's going to talk about the public library. I'll actually let her do all the talking, but just I think it's going to be about as a site of multi-modes of design, as well as considering how the institution, the library, fits into the larger ecology of civic, organizational, and systems design. So, Jim.
So As Ken said, I just started a new job this year, and I entered into a perfect storm of transitions and turmoil in 3 different departments, which meant that I've done no research at all this year. So instead, I'm going to share kind of practical work that I've been doing that's also related to more theoretical and academic research I've been doing for the past 20 years with public libraries. And this has been a really, this might sound corny, but a joyous sight of work, because not only am I studying the history and theory of libraries, but also have had a chance to work, especially through the New York Metropolitan Library Council, or the Metropolitan New York Library Council, which serves 300 or so libraries and archives across New York City, to kind of put a lot of those ideas into action. And then that practical work also has inspired a lot of my academic research too. And maybe some of you can relate to this. I have been a little disillusioned and frustrated with higher education this past year in particular. So thinking about an institution that is not perfect, but in many days embodies my own values much more so than elite private institutions. So that's why I wanted to focus on this. And also, when I proposed this topic back in the fall, I did not know this was going to be National Library Week too. So it's kind of a serendipitous coincidence of activities here. Just out of curiosity, are any of you librarians or work in the library here? Okay, thanks. All right, so just about me, my first book was based on my dissertation. I did an ethnographic project on the Seattle Public Library. Some of you might know the architect Rem Koolhaas, the Office for Metropolitan Architecture. I followed the design of that project just to see how, as Seattle was kind of coming onto the global map as a tech hub, how they designed this new civic building to embody the transition from analog to digital media, or the blend of them, and also to embody a new urban global identity for Seattle. So that was my first book. I have this is a screenshot of multiple, this is all on, most of my work is open access. I try to prioritize open access publishing. But these are just some screenshots from my website of the various other pieces I've written about libraries and archives and knowledge institutions over the past 20 years or so. And then I have a chapter about libraries in my most recent book that Ken mentioned, which is ostensibly about smart cities, but I wanted to have the smart city people, the urban tech people, the engineers also think about how they could learn from and maybe collaborate with librarians to think about things like data privacy, public service in a different way, and vice versa, to have people working in library and information science think about how they could meaningfully inform and maybe learn from engineering. And I'll talk about some examples of where those places could come together in an ideal world, maybe. I've also had a good fortune of working with the Architectural League of New York, and this is, again, design writ large. I understand that because this design initiative is housed within engineering here, I was lucky to work at Parsons for almost 20 years, where design is everything from graphic design to fashion to transdisciplinary design to architecture to urban planning. So it is multiple manifestations, so I'm going to take that more capacious approach here. And I hope that, especially if any of you are engineers, you will think about how your practice can actually apply to these different realms as well. But in terms of architecture, I've been able to work with the Architectural League of New York, which is one of the oldest professional organizations for licensed architects in New York City, to do a project they did about little free libraries. They were kind of passé now, but back when they were new, they had a lot of commissioned projects to think about pop-up libraries to activate commercial spaces, public spaces. And then another project we did 10 years ago now, it's the 10th anniversary, called Redesigning Branch Libraries. So we had an international call for participants, eventually had 8 teams, mixed teams, everybody from like real estate developers to architects to a variety of other fields. Librarians as well were on those teams, to rethink what the branch library is, especially when they are an underfunded institution. How can you use various forms of design, tech development, civic tech to reinvigorate and refresh an institution, particularly when you're working with small budgets. And then I've also taught many classes about libraries in a school that didn't have a library LIS program, but particularly within relation to creative technologists and media studies scholars. What do they have to say about, and why should they care about libraries as a civic institution? And this is a screenshot of one of the classes I taught at the New School for many years. And as Ken also said, I've been on the board of the Metropolitan New York Library Council for about 10 years. I've been the president of that board for about 5. And that's been a really rewarding thing to work with the directors and various other staff at everything from the MoMA library to small historical associations to all the university libraries to the directors of all the public library systems. There are 3 in New York: NYPL, Queens, and Brooklyn. Also, in my first year at Penn, amongst the many sources of turmoil is that there was a lot of tension within our library system. The the then director left. A lot of the staff had quit. So now I find myself on the search committee to find the new associate provost and director of libraries. We're having our final meeting to make our recommendations tomorrow. This has been a very time-intensive thing. Also in part why this is not a new research project I'm sharing with you, because this has been a pretty heavy labor lift for me. And also just thinking about library and design ecology, I wanted to think about how this institution, this social infrastructure, sits at the convergence of multiple forms of design, how it also sits as a both physical and conceptual or metaphorical hub or center of various social ecologies. Here is a map of Princeton, kind of showing where the libraries are. In many campuses, they are intentionally located at the center of campus because they both are supposed to serve people coming from multiple disciplines. They're supposed to serve as kind of a symbolic hub of what we, in an ideal world, claim matters on our campuses. And ideally, they're also spaces where interdisciplinary things are supposed to happen, where people from different fields are coming together to talk about their shared concerns. I'm just going to skip over this, but one example of that is of a library that really embodies those principles is the relatively new library at Temple. This is a Snohetta design. Snohetta and Meccanu are the two firms that in recent years have kind of dominated the library design market. Before it was Shepley, Bulfinch, Abbott, and Richardson, and all the Beaux-Arts architect Carrere and Hastings from the turn of the 20th century. So Snohetta has done a lot of libraries recently, and this is their new library. 2019, it opened right at the center of campus. Speaking of this idea of the library as an interdisciplinary space, I mean, this is something that, again, has been center of our library search at Penn, and as part of the mission statement of most universities, that the library is a space for interdisciplinary work, for undisciplining knowledge, and then John Durham Peters has a word that I like to use often, intentional promiscuity, which tends to have kind of negative connotations in many cases, but just kind of licensed, really freewheeling thinking beyond the boundaries of particular fields. And that's what the capacious kind of all fields of knowledge encapsulated in a collection, possibilities that a library has the potential to offer. So I'm presenting a pretty rosy picture here, but academic libraries have also faced threats in recent years, not unrelated to the political turmoil we've experienced in many realms of American and global culture. Particularly, I think you at Princeton have fortunately been relatively isolated from this, but Penn, lots of donor uproar. Columbia's and Barnard are facing it right now. Harvard, of course, MIT, lots of alums questioning the value of the liberal arts and the collections in the library. Not to the extent that you see in public libraries, which I'll talk about in a bit, but there is a renewed steeled conviction, I think, amongst librarians who really believe in the mission that this is a space for us to demonstrate the value of engineers, business majors, Wharton and particularly, actually talking to people in the liberal arts and vice versa. So framing academic libraries as a space for interdisciplinary work, and especially for the place to have difficult discussions about all the hot button issues that are so fraught and contentious today. In terms of public libraries, which is what I'm going to focus on, you probably, how many of you have been following the news and seen the difficult days, the dark days that public libraries are facing right now? Is this, okay, I see some head nods. I'll go through it a little bit. But this is just released this week, the new American Library Association, ALA, State of America's Libraries report. Emily Drabinski, one of the first out queer Marxist librarians, is the president, and as you can probably imagine in this political climate, her being out about that identity has attracted a lot of backlash. A lot of states have even tried to outlaw membership in the ALA because of her, overtness about her identity. And the headline is kind of an understatement, says a lot. And these are not ordinary times. These are actually extraordinary and very difficult times for a lot of public libraries. And then if we think about design, one of the challenges that libraries are facing is we could think about a framework for design. Another way of using that term in a sense is to have designs on, to want to manipulate or to steer or to undermine in many cases. And that's what a lot of the external force facing public libraries today are various, in some cases, nefarious forces having designs on the institution. A few examples of that. Does anybody know who this is? Oh, his name is right there. I'm giving it away. It's Chris Rufo. As you probably know, he's been orchestrator of many, especially behind like the critical race theory, co-opting that term, making it mean all bad things. And he has taken on the public, or the library itself. Here we see American Library Association wants to reframe sexually explicit books as diverse. So in other words, anything that addresses LGBTQ issues is about grooming children. That's the framework they're putting out there. He's also the one behind, which is another quote from Twitter, which I'm not on anymore, but fortunately a lot of these are kind of screenshot and available. So there are no book bans in America. Authors have a First Amendment right to publish whatever they want, but public libraries and schools are not obligated to subsidize them. Voters get to decide which texts public institutions transmit to children. But apparently they do get to decide what texts they don't get to transmit to children by pulling them out of the collections. That's kind of the other subtext of what he's talking about here. So he's taken on explicitly libraries as an institution, but as I said, he was really a big figure behind the plagiarism controversy around Pauline Gay, really sicked people on using what would you call them, amateur investigators to look at especially the published research of most black scholars, or many black scholars around the country are really a part of Chris Rufo's army in the whole plagiarism debate that's going on right now. And then also one of his great successes from a couple years ago was to freeze the brand of critical race theory and make it mean things like all the bad parts of affirmative action, turning it toxic. And it's not a coincidence that a lot of the scholars that are now being targeted through his plagiarism crusade are also scholars of color. So this is it. So he has also turned his attention on the library as an embodiment of bad things. This is not exactly my graphic design identity, but there are other organizations like Moms for Liberty you might have heard of who also have designs on the library. They have made book bans. They have packaged kind of design activism kits for their members to help them to identify, to target library boards, to get on library boards, to get books taken out of libraries. They also have a whole system called book reports where people can write incriminating short reports, which if any of you are instructors, if you were to read these, they are not actually, they would probably be a D- version of a book report, kind of just highlighting all the intentionally misreading, the worst possible intention, bad faith readings of books. So these again are not, this is not a great example of graphic design, I would say, but it's definitely kind of a design, you could maybe call it activist or civic design, designing campaigns to empower people with relatively little political savvy to know how to infiltrate public institutions and get books removed specifically from collections. There's another person, Kelly Jensen, who's on the censorship beat for Book Riot, which is like a literary website, a literary journalism. One of the most recent things she's talked about is Louisiana is criminalizing membership of the American Library Association. So librarians could actually be imprisoned or held criminally liable for just being a member of a professional organization, specifically because Emily Drabinski, the Marxist lesbian, is the head of that institution. So this is these are the lengths to which it's going in some states. And this is just a relatively recent March 29th, just a couple weeks ago, summary piece she put together looking at the various tactics that different groups have had in their own designs on the library. And I'm just going to go through some of the headings here. So I can see it right here. So they're doing destruction from within by leaders and or library boards. So people who essentially want to destroy things from within will get themselves elected to library boards. You probably know that civic participation in local elections is really, really low. Most people don't even know that they can run for or be elected for their library boards. Not many people have historically cared about who's on them. And because of that lack of historical participation, it's easy for people to get themselves on these boards and then do a lot of damage from the inside. So that's one strategy that's been sometimes undermining directors or appointed by mayors who also want to undo that institution. Privatization of public libraries is another thing that's happening, just as privatization of so many public services. Libraries are yet another one. And particularly, as you probably know, their reliance on vendors, especially as we move towards ebooks and digital resources like digital collections that we all use for our research. A lot of these are private companies, private commercial companies, some of which, like Thomson Reuters and Relex, who run LexisNexis, a lot of other databases you might know, are also tied very closely to police data and surveillance data. So they're actually a part of like a surveillance state. They just also happen to have academic research as part of their org chart, I guess you could say. And then a few others you can see in the bottom, ending affiliation with the American Library Association, legal loopholes that allow for outright closure, electing to terminate funding, as some city councils have chosen to do in many cities around the country because librarians have refused to remove books like Genderqueer, which is the #1 most contentious book, and then lots of bomb and death threats also. And you've probably also seen in the news one of the more kind of telegenic examples is Drag Queen Story Hour. The Proud Boys often show up to protest these types of activities too. So like real potential threat and sometimes actual threat of bodily harm. But then there's also the possibility that some advocates for the library are engaging in what Carl DeSalvo would call kind of counter-adversarial design. So they already have people who have designs on their institution. So how do you engage in designing a practice to counter those counterattacks or counter those attacks? Some of you might know the work of Miriam Kaba, who's a prison abolitionist, and she is one of the figures behind a group that called For the People, a leftist library project. And as a lifelong community organizer, Miriam just has an amazing skill set in deciding how and determining or knowing how to articulate the stakes of a particular issue, whether it's mass criminalization or mass incarceration or attacks on libraries. And using graphic design and really intelligible, sequenced toolkits and guides for people to get involved. And this is an example, I think, that where she does that really well, the skill set she's applied across so many different issues. So just a couple screenshots from the website. You see they've even kind of tried to break down or operationalize their mission into a few different strategies like defending, building local power, reminding people that books change lives. Lots of places to take action, lots of links on the website for ways you can get involved. They even have kind of a boot camp, a few-week-long online boot camp for people who want to run for their local public libraries. And then the people who do, many of them then get elected and then offer testimonials and serve as like a phone chain or spreading the wealth then to help other people figure out how to get on their own library boards or become involved locally. So here we just have a couple. You can see like these buttons here. This is great graphic interaction design. Might not win an AIGA award, but in terms of like getting the job done, it's actually really effective. So you kind of choose the issue that you feel that you can contribute to, and then you click the button. It's like, I can do this. And that's like a really nice call to action, interpolation, hailing you into service. And then they also have a resource center and just really small incremental things you can do, including something as tiny as just showing up at a board meeting or getting a library card, just because numbers matter in some cases. If you can show circulation numbers, number of people in the door, number of library card holders, all of these things speak the quantitative language that works for funders and city managers or municipal managers. Just a couple other examples, again, kind of branding with stickers and banners that are really good for social media dissemination. And then breaking it down to 10 things or 10 ways you can do help your library, everything from getting a card to voting in local elections to fighting censorship to donating to different groups. And one thing I was just thinking about last October is, this is from Blue Sky, my own skeet. I still hate saying that, but that's what they're called there. But Libraries for the People is such a great example of how to do community organizing, how to scale and incentivize activism for people with varying degrees of experience, and it demonstrates the value of design in such efforts. And there are some really interesting graphic design firms that I think really focus on the visual language and are politically and ethically sympathetic or simpatico with a lot of social movements. There's one including Partner and Partners, who Miriam Kaba works with a lot on several of her projects. They just kind of get the visual or graphic language of a lot of social movements, and they have designed a lot of the material for some of these campaigns I've shared with you. Another graphic design firm that really works a lot with movements and social causes is, as their name implies, cause and matter. And just a couple other examples, in addition to the For the People program that I showed you, there's another one called Unite Against Book Bans. another one called Get Ready, Stay Ready, another one called Fight for the First, meaning First Amendment, and then one of them was also, or they've collectively put together even a Google spreadsheet. Some of you might know the work of graphic designer Paul Solelis, who writes a lot about kind of what he calls urgent communication. And especially during the pandemic, the Google spreadsheet became like this really humble way to marshal a bureaucratic form of media to engage in mutual aid or to get people organized around, dissemination of resources. So even taking something that's not really hyper fancy designed, but using that to design kind of social collective efforts. And we see that here. The libraries themselves are engaging in this. Again, this isn't super fancy graphic design, but every year in New York, I'm not quite sure how your funding works here in Princeton. I know you have a really great new library that was just opened up, renovated a couple years ago. But every year in New York, the mayor puts out a budget. He always proposes to cut the library budget by millions of dollars. And then we have a campaign. They call it the budget dance. The libraries put out a call for people to show their support, to donate, to write their council people, and using posters and kind of collective efforts across the three systems to design a system to make it easy for people to write their council people and to express their support. There's a deep history of using graphic design, communication design in particular, to support this kind of library ecology. These are just some WPA, Works Progress Administration posters from the Free Libraries Digital Collection. If any of you have looked, like there's just so much fantastic public domain historical work, especially from the WPA. I particularly like that one in the middle. Like, books will help solve many of your technical problems, know your job, maybe especially pertinent to engineers. It's just a couple more examples. This is specifically for Philadelphia, the Free Library from the 1960s for a lot of their book, their summer book, summer book camps. So again, just marshaling graphic design in interesting ways to make the myriad offerings of this institution intelligible and accessible and exciting to different publics. So speaking of the 10 ways that the Libraries for the People project is addressing, the way I'm going to structure the rest of this is 13 ways of looking at a library. And this is a reference to Wallace Stevens' 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, one of my favorite poems. But it's also a good way to structure a talk if you don't really have a thesis statement, I'll just mention. And I'll also say that I've shared a version of this. Various architecture studios around Yale made the library kind of the typology for their second year studio for a while. At Columbia, Graduate School Architecture Planning and Preservation, their third year architecture studio was focused on the library for 3 or 5 years. And I would always go every year near the beginning of the semester just to talk about all the different things a library could be to help them think imaginatively and capaciously about what their designs could be. So I'm sharing a version of that with you here today. So they're going to be prepared for an abrupt shift in graphic style here because I'm going to switch to that other slide deck. So here are the 13 ways of looking at a library. The reference to Wallace Stevens, but I'm not going to play the poem, even though I have the audio embedded here. So one obvious way is the collection itself. Most people expect to see books when you walk inside. And if you read any contemporary public or what's sort of popular writing about the library, one of the first sentences will be, did you know libraries aren't just books? I'm like, actually, I did know that. They've never been just books, but that seems to be a trope that most popular writing about them starts off with. And I just have a couple examples here. Like, we want people to understand that libraries aren't just those brick and mortar places full of dusty books. Oh, they're always dusty too. So that's, but this is actually a graphic that OMA prepared for the Seattle Public Library, I think in 1999 in their concept book, showing the proliferation of resources. If you consider like the Library of Alexandria a library, which it is, like we're even talking pre-books, pre-codex. So libraries have had a myriad forms. The Carnegie era, lots of newspapers, record albums, all types of things. Just a couple examples, though. There's a long history of libraries being designed around the geometry and aesthetics of the book stack itself being a really central metaphor and organizing principle, part of the shaping the ecology, the architectural ecology around it. Some of you might recognize the Beinecke Library down here from Yale, the Rare Books Library in the bottom right. And this is about Biblioteca Vasconcelos in Mexico City in the top right. I mentioned newspapers also. This was a way, especially in the Carnegie era, to draw people in who might not otherwise be. This is a fraught issue. Like libraries of the Carnegie era were really dedicated towards uplift. You wanted to pull people in where they are and then elevate them to more rarefied stuff, smarter stuff. So you'd bring them in with newspapers or novels and then introduce them to fine literature or nonfiction books. It's highly fraught, kind of suggesting that entertainment or journalism isn't serious in and of itself. But they'd have reading rooms to draw people in and then ideally introduce them to the various other resources they had. So we have an ecology, again, arising around this particular media form. Especially considering issues of disability, libraries are really attuned to issues of accessibility for a long time. Some of you might know the work of Mara Mills at NYU, who does a lot about the history of the talking book, about books on tape, other formats. So this is an example of books for especially the visually impaired. Records have been a part of libraries for a while, including, I did a project about 15 years ago now, about the Woodbury Poetry Room at Harvard, which is an Alvar Aalto design, one of his few designs in the US, where they had these really great hexagonal tables where 6 people could sit around them and listen to a record album together. Very prescient in first recognizing that poetry is not just words on a page, it's also authors reading their own work, and that's worthy of being recorded. But then also recognizing the value of collective listening, the pedagogical value of listening together. So I wish I had thought to include a picture of that. All this is to say is that it's not, again, not just books. Libraries have been creatively designed, creating ecologies to accommodate multiple media formats in their collections. Vinyl, if you haven't heard, is coming back in many cases. So Brooklyn has a whole vinyl collection, which really was reinvigorated. They had a whole Jay-Z exhibit last year, you might have heard, got some controversial press, but I thought was fantastic. It drew record attendance, record numbers of applications for cards, and people who might not have otherwise been incented to go to the public library were going to see this Jay-Z show, which is really a great example of an archival exhibition, if you ask my opinion. But it really, again, invigorated or reinvigorated a lot of their interest in vinyl collecting. The pandemic, when the physical books weren't as readily available, really shifted the pendulum or the move towards ebooks. And it was already moving in that direction, but it just kind of amplified the move towards digital collections. So this is, again, where engineers come in to think about developing both software, hardware, digital rights management systems, which is really controversial now. You might have followed the lawsuit against the Internet Archive for making a lot of books available during the pandemic. And several publishers sued them. The publishers won. It was kind of a heartbreaking case. I mean, they were trying to make books available to people who could not access them. But some authors and their representatives claimed that it was kind of infringing on their right to sell their books. But anyway, these are issues that could be pertinent to engineers and technologists in myriad fields. Libby is a platform that a lot of libraries use. Overdrive is a company that many libraries rely upon, which is a commercial company. There was a New Yorker article about Overdrive. I can't even see the tiny type here. It's maybe 2 years or so ago. This company charges a ton of money. It's kind of a bit monopolistic. Libraries really rely on Overdrive, but it charges a ton of money for licensing. So this is, again, part of the challenge of the fact that the collection, a lot of it in the digital realm, doesn't live in the walls of the building anymore. It's licensed from commercial providers who can take things away if they want, who can up the prices if they want. Any of you in the sciences probably know that your libraries have battles with Elsevier all the time, who kind of has a big monopoly in science publications and they're amongst the most rapacious of publishers, really restrictive licenses for authors, really high prices for libraries. But they kind of control the market in many cases, so you're stuck with them. Maybe there's an engineering workaround to this. I'm trying to because we're in an engineering building, I'm assuming some of you care about these things. So. Another issue that, this isn't really an engineering challenge, it's more a service challenge, but I'm sure it had to do something with registration on the back end of the library website. As so many states were restricting the access to certain types of contentious issued books in their own libraries, the Brooklyn Library, several others have signed on since then, but 3 years ago now, the Brooklyn Library, or maybe even 3 or 4 years ago, developed this program called Books Unbanned, which meant that any teenager in any state of the country could get a Brooklyn library card and have access to their entire digital collection, which allowed for them to explore topics that were considered verboten in their home states for a variety of reasons. And then we also could think about what kinds of media what are the kinds of media that require different kinds of active engagement? What are their implications for design? We have libraries with robotics clubs. We have libraries with gaming clubs, libraries with kind of code camps, all different types of technologies. This is where engineering is kind of turned into like a citizen practice. There are some really great examples of, it's actually sponsored by Best Buy, weirdly, in Brooklyn, a couple different branches where they have really great maker spaces with all kinds of engineering technology, trying to incentivize usually kids in disenfranchised, under-resourced neighborhoods to have access to free technology, trained technicians and teachers to maybe encourage them to enter STEM fields with, I would say, STEAM fields because they want to put the arts in there too. And then if we think even more capaciously, maybe more to the analog realm, a lot of libraries have seed collections. There are seed libraries, zine libraries, tool libraries. These are some libraries have also like baking materials, like you can rent cooking materials or mixers or whatever you might need. So these have spatial demands too. Not all the sections are going to be this long, but okay. So number 2 is the library is a site of epistemological exploration. So how can you use this as an ecology in which you can explore what we know and how we know what we know and what's worth knowing, and the production of knowledge too. So the question we could ask, or I would ask here, is how can libraries validate and celebrate community knowledge and cultural production? How can they create spaces for patrons to make their own media, which might then be validated and incorporated into the collection itself? So just one example of that is in Queens, there's the Queens Memory Project. Lots of libraries have oral history projects. I mean, again, you might hear as well. I haven't looked so much into what Princeton is doing. They also have hip hop programs, so drawing on the birth of hip hop or the historical significance of hip hop in Queens. They put together a local archival community archive of materials that are relevant to that local history, that it also happens to be of national and international interest. In the Washington, D.C. library, they have a public memory lab where people can bring in their own home collections, the shoebox full of books you have in the closet, whatever it is that you might have, digitize them. If you want, you can contribute them to the digital collections of the library, but you also then have those digitized to share with your family, to preserve for posterity for different maybe historical associations you're part of. The Metro Library Council, which I'm part of, also had this thing called Culture in Transit for many years, where they would take a digitization station around to different neighborhoods, to different senior centers or communities, Chinatown Community Association, whatever, and encourage people to bring stuff in to digitize it also. I mentioned the teen stuff. So lots of library, when I wrote my book 20 years ago, they were still trying to figure out how to target teenagers. There was the children's section, then there was the adult section. Teenagers often got some kind of condescending Miami Vice aesthetic space, if you remember, like 1980s Miami aesthetic, which I think they kind of didn't quite understand what the kids wanted. But there's been a lot of really great attention, a lot of specific librarians there specifically for teenagers in libraries. Again, looking at the social, economic ecology of people who converge in this space. And Brooklyn, again, I really love the Brooklyn Library, have done some great things. They have these tech centers that I mentioned before. They also have paid opportunities for teenagers to work there and serve as tutors to people in different communities, to work on some of these oral history projects. Internships within the larger system. Missoula actually won one of the AIA, American Institute of Architects, awards for Best Library Design last year. They have done some interesting things into their larger architectural ecology. They have incorporated partnership spaces for some of these organizations. One is kind of like a citizen science laboratory. Others are about like community wireless, helping people to get access to high-speed internet if they're in underserved neighborhoods, for instance. So actually, we're incorporating these civic partnerships into the space itself. And in our politically contentious age, some libraries have done interesting things to try to impact civic discourse. So we might call this civic design, you could say. Skokie at the top in Illinois had a thing, I'm not sure if they still have it, but it was, especially at the height of the Trump era, a thing called the Civic Lab, where they would curate collections of resources about fraught topics and then invite people, often in mediated conversations with community organizers, to have discussions in a very multifaceted panel discussion about whatever the most contentious issues of the day might have been. Another thing that I'm really excited about is the fact that, as you probably know, well, you don't know this part, but I am teaching a class called Local Media this semester at Penn, looking at especially the decimation of a lot of local media resources around the country, so many news deserts. But what you might not know is that a lot of those, some libraries have offered space and resources for more community-driven, not-for-profit enterprises to flourish in the library or to start up in the library. So it's like, librarians don't like it when you call a space neutral, because they say, like, we don't want a place where anything goes. Like, you can't riot or harass people here. Like, we actually have a stand for inclusivity. That is not neutral. But in terms of welcoming people with different skill sets, a library could be an inviting space for the burgeoning or the germination of new local journalism efforts, as we can see here with the City Bureau project in Chicago and Charlotte Journalism Collaborative. Brooklyn has also been experimenting with this thing called the Brooklyn Newsroom, where they're getting especially teenagers involved in local journalism around their neighborhoods, and also teaching them some cool stuff like printing, like risograph printing or letterpress or editing skills, all different types of stuff like that. And there's a journalist from the City, you might know the not-for-profit newspaper in New York City, who's collaborating with them on some of this. So they're getting real, and the Times also, some volunteer people from these legacy publications are contributing to the mentorship projects. Another example would be increasing like what actually counts as knowledge. Have any of you been to the Greenpoint Library and Environmental Education Center? This opened in the middle of the pandemic. It's by Marble Fairbanks Architects, not that that should mean anything to you, but it is, as the name implies. Greenpoint in Brooklyn is a Superfund site. There was a big oil spill there many years ago, and as the payout, the community got millions of dollars, and they could decide what they wanted to do with it. One of the things they chose to do was to build a new library. That's what they elected to do themselves. But they wanted it not just to be a traditional library, but one that was also about environmental education. So this building, again, expands like what is worth knowing. You can't read this tiny type here, but one of the things, they include a lot of wet labs. They have a whole people on board who are trying to think about indigenous knowledge, like traditional Lenape, natural knowledge, and incorporating that into the classification systems, the materials in the collection. So just really expanding like what is worth knowing, what types of stuff do we think should be happening in a library. So you read a book about mycology, and then you go into the wet lab and you do some work with mushrooms. Or you go up onto the roof deck. I'll show you some more pictures later. And you grow the stuff that you're talking about. Also more in the indigenous realm. This is a new branch library that's opening in Toronto soon. The Smoke Architecture's specific library, all about indigenous. It's essentially the entire design team is based on indigenous designers and really experimenting with different collection materials, classification systems, to have it be an embodiment of indigenous ways of knowing. Library is a site of cultural production. This was a lot shorter. So we have everything from exhibition spaces. More libraries are incorporating these types of things. Performance spaces. These are often open or have access facility or possibilities that are after hours. So you might be able to have evening events or weekend events when the library proper isn't open. The Information Commons in Brooklyn, they also have a lot of libraries, including New York Public Library in Brooklyn, have production studios for music production and a lot of other forms of cultural production. I co-curated an exhibit at the new Helsinki Public Library that opened in 2019. And there they have some pretty amazing kind of very technologically advanced knitting and fabric and kind of sewing studios, a cooking demonstration area, great maker spaces. Again, validating this not just as a fun thing to do, but actually as a means of cultural and knowledge production, some of which then comes into the collection itself. And there's a long history of library-themed art, or inviting people to use the collection as inspiration to create art installations. There's the whole percent for art thing that many cities have, where if you have a budget for a public project, you have to dedicate at least 1% of that to public art that then goes into those spaces. And I co-organized an exhibit at Metro, I don't know, 5 years ago or so now, looking at a lot of art projects, and especially kind of creative coding, critical technology projects that happen in libraries. And we also have just different metaphors to think about the library and how these might generate different design approaches or different ways of conceiving them. Even ecology is a metaphor. So what does it mean if we call a library an ecology versus if we call it like a platform or if we call it a think tank? Each of those kind of speaks the language of a different discipline and might draw on different value systems. So I wrote a piece close to 10 years ago or so called Library as Infrastructure. So what does it mean to think of it as a technical, social, ecological infrastructure, all these things simultaneously? And this was in part a reference to or response to David Weinberger's piece called Library as Platform. And if we take the very kind of tech-specific language of platform, there are certain expectations, practices, knowledge, or expertise that are embedded in the whole idea of calling something a platform. And even the fact that there's a pop-up that it means that I couldn't screenshot the article makes us think about the gate. So what about the gatekeeping, literal technical limitations and metaphors of determining what gets in and out? I also was the keynote at the American College and Research Libraries Conference a few years ago where I looked at some of these metaphors. So what does it mean to think of like the library as a stack, to use the whole concept of the technical stack that technological people here, programmers might be familiar with, or as a platform or as an interface. It also could be because there's a lot of interest in maintenance. You had, Chen mentioned my work on repair and maintenance. Just as branches are upgraded, if there's any possibility for renovation, sometimes they'll have pop-up spaces in an empty storefront, for instance, to use that as a staging area to try out ideas that then you could actually implement in the later space. So this is like a microcosmic ecology to test bed some certain things that could then be implemented on a more formal or larger scale in the final space. This was the Sunset Park Library, and I'll show you its final iteration, which opened just a couple months ago, and it's amazing in a little bit. So we could also think about a library as a network of service interfaces. How can the various mediated manifestations of the library, its website, its catalog, various apps, distributed pop-ups, convey the breadth of its resources and programming? So the service desk, especially, and we're thinking like in the Carnegie era, the analog era, the service desk is like your first literal interface where you actually meet somebody with a face looking at you to either say, you're not welcome here, especially if you're a person of color, or to say, welcome in, how can I help you? So various degrees of welcome, sense of interpolation, of hailing or rejection. Especially during the pandemic, there was a lot more focused on the design of library websites and apps in particular to help provide a panoply of interfaces for people to interface to access the collection. Wayfinding inside is something that, if any of you have architectural experience, it usually takes a year or so of a building being open until you realize what kind of signs you need, because you don't know people how are going to be inclined to circulate throughout the space. So just thinking about this as an interface to make a space feel open and accessible to people. There's also been, especially amongst kind of more creative technology end of engineering and interface or interaction designers, experimentations with library interfaces to allow for different ways of exploring a collection. This is on the left by between Rost and Wu in the Harvard Library Innovation Lab, a piece called Haystacks, which allows for kind of a keyword word cloud searching. There used to be a unit within the NYPL Labs, which is a bunch of software engineers and designers. It was amazing. It was like a golden era. Doesn't exist anymore. But they developed so many really cool tools for like georectification of maps, for transcribing hard to OCR digital materials, and developing a whole bunch of different interfaces for people to interact with their, especially their digital collections, which are voluminous. And sadly, I met with one of them just for dinner a couple days ago, and a lot of these links are broken now. So they developed this amazing set of tools, but this is the challenge. They were defunded. There's no money for maintaining this stuff. That said, a lot of the folks who were part of this team then went on to do other things that are kind of carrying the torch a little bit, like Bert Span, who developed this great mapping technology, now has his own mapping, like public domain mapping company in, or not-for-profit, I think, in Amsterdam. More about apps, lots of developing of apps throughout the pandemic. And then this is a very analog interface, bulletin boards, which is something that a lot of my students are studying in our local media class. They're just intrigued by the resonance, the continued importance of physical flyers hanging up in a space that are really kind of locally, very hyper-local in their communication. So this is another interface to help people know about the library itself as an interface to other social resources around a city. There's also some great design and engineering. These happen to be engineers who did this project in Boston, of taking the library out into public spaces to help people who might not be incentivized to come in or know that it's available to them, to take it out into public space as an invitation to help people know what is there in greater mass if you go to the building itself. And then I wrote a bit about that. This is my first ever article I wrote for Places about some of these little kind of distributed pop-up libraries. We even see this in organizations like Libraries Without Borders, which deploys libraries in kits in conflict zones and war zones to take some semblance of normalcy or some information resources to people who might be offline or whose libraries, as you probably know, most of the libraries in Gaza have been decimated. So this is throughout, for millennia, oppressors have decimated knowledge institutions to erase history and access to knowledge. Most of the universities there have been bombed as well. Library is a site of embodied learning, so just remembering that, especially, again, relates to architects and engineers, that there are multiple senses engaged in the way we learn. I wrote a piece, again, probably about 15 years ago, working with a lot of acoustic engineers about how they design both exhibition spaces and libraries as sonic spaces. Typically, when you think of a library, the standard historical and outmoded way of thinking about it is the shushing environment, wanting to be quiet. But there's so much loud, exciting activity that happens in a wet lab, parents reading to children, music performances. This is where acoustic engineering becomes really important because you're dividing a gradient of acoustics from quiet to loud, from public to more private. So you can use acoustic materials, you can use kind of targeted microphones to broadcast sound. So all different types of technologies and materials you can use to make a library a I keep using these visual metaphors, but it's something that causes an acoustic or sonic gradient. Materials libraries is something, the one at the top is from Penn, the one at the bottom is from San Jose State University. So just especially if you're working in a region with a lot of designers, do any of you use materials libraries? Okay, all right, so some people are familiar with it. Yeah, so just especially if you're an architect, you want to know, like, what are the latest, I don't know, floor coverings or tiles I can use, or what are the latest like acoustic panels or wallpapers. Fashion, there's at Parsons in the New School, there's a healthy materials lab, which includes sustainably produced building materials and textiles for all the fashion designers and architects. Also thinking again about the multisensorial is at Philadelphia Free Library, there's a test kitchen. They have a great cookbook collection, both historical and contemporary. And then they have a kitchen where you activate those ideas and produce culture. This is not just like a skill, it's actually knowledge production. Food is at the center of so many knowledge communities, and this space activates that idea. Lots of libraries learned from the pandemic and included outdoor spaces. It used to be that if you had a patio, you'd lock it off because you're afraid somebody's going to walk off with your book. They're going to take that comic book and throw it over the fence and leave with it, kind of with unauthorized borrowing. But I think the pandemic reshaped those priorities, and a lot more libraries have outdoor spaces now. Again, recognizing that just the spaces of gathering, the ambiance matters to how we learn. And gardens are another thing that a lot of people are engaging with. The pretty broad shift here, a big shift, libraries and intertwined logistical systems. This is a project from the St. Gallen Arts Library, or the Sitterwerk Library in St. Gallen, Switzerland, an art school, where they invite the students to reshelve the books almost as an art or poetic project themselves, to create like a shelf of like a gradient of color or writing spine poetry or something. And then every night, RCD or RFID reader or scanner goes by and reads all the RFID codes and replaces them in the catalog so you can find them again. But it's using technology, kind of this is an engineered solution to invite creative classification and organization of collections. This again is an engineering challenge of people who might be logistical engineers. The New York Public Library and the Brooklyn Library have a shared collection. So all the most popular books, the libraries buy them together and they float to where they're needed. That was developing a whole logistical system, kind of like a FedEx center in Long Island City, to allow for the distribution of these materials. So that was an engineering challenge, just to allow for them to save money so they're not duplicating 3 different sets across the 3 different library systems, and to make sure they go where they're needed. Also, a library is a hub for civic infrastructure and public interest technology. I mentioned the NYPL Labs before, a group of technologists who probably could have gotten jobs at Google, but instead chose to work for probably a much lower salary at the New York Public Library, developing technology that's not about extraction and surveillance, but instead is about kind of public interest, access, privacy, other values that are really central to the way a library works. So this is based on the idea that the library doesn't merely provide access to media and media production training, it also serves as a vital media infrastructure. How might library designs promote infrastructural literacy too? So some of the ways they do that, some people take issue with the term the technology petting zoo, but this is at Austin. Really beautiful Lake Flato recently opened design. I think it opened in like 2018 or 19. But it's there to try out new models of technology, maybe like what you'd find at an Apple store to try out stuff, but with a trained technologist there who could talk to you about things like privacy setting or data extraction or things that a salesperson might not want to tell you. Also the maintainability, service contracts, things like that. Also, some libraries want to make the backstage visible, so you're aware of all the infrastructure and expertise that makes it possible for you to access this material. This is the book sorting facility in the Stavros Niarchos Library on 5th Avenue and 41st Street in New York City, to let you see how the materials are circulating throughout the building on these conveyor belts. A lot of people love to peer in windows and see robots at work. And this is the North Carolina NC State, where most of their collection is in compact storage. It's too narrow for people to access, so when you call for a book, a robot will zoom around and pull it from a shelf, pull out the drawer and pull it from a shelf and then deliver it to you. And people love watching this. So maybe it's promoting some robotics literacy. And then also helping people understand about Wi-Fi as well, because libraries are a big hub, especially in underserved neighborhoods, of providing community access to community wireless. I did a whole talk a couple years ago about all these different kind of homegrown community tech developments or projects that are happening in libraries. They have Brooklyn, New York Public Library you can rent hotspots from them. In New York City, there are still 40% of the city does not have access to high-speed internet at home, which is kind of hard to believe. Everybody who might be on campus at a Penn or a Princeton, that's kind of hard to believe sometimes. But a lot of these public institutions allow for people to rent hotspots and have free access to high-speed internet, which was especially necessary during the pandemic for school and work. I'm going to try to go faster through these. So there's also the library as an assemblage of furnishings. This is something I worked a lot about on various fellowships and projects over the year, just the history of the bookshelf, how tables and chairs and things might seem purely aesthetic, but instead they really shape the way we interact with the media available to us and one another. As part of that reimagining branch library study, one of the teams, Situ Studio, developed a whole kit of parts. So if you have a really limited floor plan or space for your branch library or a pop-up in a transit center, you have a compact kind of kit where everything fits together, and then you can deploy different things at different times of day to allow for it to be a screening studio, or to be a recording space, or a wet lab for citizen science projects, or a kids reading area. So this furniture is modular to allow for multiple uses. It's also a sanctuary, and furniture, again, can help to kind of activate this idea of the library as a sanctuary, as we can see here with this particular chair, obviously. But also, speaking of engineering and data privacy, this is where libraries have designed and tried to use technology and service protocols to protect patrons' privacy. They've become really well known for that, especially in the era of the Patriot Act, as some of you might know. And they tend to not save their data so that nobody can come to the library and say, please tell me who's taken out books about gender fluidity or about Marxism or whatever. This is obvious, but it's one of my favorites, just reminding us that the library is a public space. Lots of ways of manifesting public space. Typically, it was the Grand Beaux-Arts Carnegie Library, which was kind of exciting to people to realize that, like, I'm just a humble person and I deserve a building this fancy. But that is an architectural style that does not resonate to a multicultural population in many cases. So we see different architectural styles communicating publicness and welcome in a lot more contemporary libraries. Here's an example of a building that could have been great, the Hunter's Point in Queens. Amazing space, fantastic views, but as you can see in the staircases here on the bottom, it was widely panned for not considering about mobility issues. Anybody in a wheelchair, anybody who has any mobility concerns was not able to access the materials on those steps. So it was received a good bit of criticism for that reason. And also, I'll end with the libraries. This is I have two more, but I'll try to go through this one fast. Library as social infrastructure. Especially during the pandemic, as so many other social infrastructures were taxed, libraries became vaccination sites. They became sources of mutual aid. They become food distribution sites for people. A lot of libraries now have social workers on staff as official, full-time staff members to refer people to other resources they have available throughout their cities. Some places like Brooklyn actually have little offices throughout the building to help people access or kind of pop-up spaces for different social organizations to camp out for a while. This presents some design challenges because when a library becomes one of the few freely available public spaces in many cities, that tends to mean that some of the most challenged and folks in most need spend a lot of time there. And this has produced the need for libraries to address homeless issues, mental health issues, and there's been some challenges of dealing with violence in libraries as well. So this is another kind of partly design challenge, policy issue, but it's also a larger ecological issue. Why should it be libraries' responsibility to deal with this when part of the problem is because there's not sufficient funding for other social infrastructures and for kind of social safety nets? So I'm going to skip over some of this. So this kind of summarizes the argument about, it's great that libraries are all things to all people, that they take on all these additional responsibilities, but should we be expecting them to do that? Or should we instead be actually fully funding and supporting mental health services, homeless services, basic institute, or kind of universal basic income, if you're a proponent of that also. But this is also partly related to my final point of thinking about the library as part of a larger socio-technical ecology. Another example of that is in Seattle Public Library, where they have in some of their branches what they call a little city hall. So if you go to the library and you say, like, I'm new to the country, I need to get a passport, or I want to figure out how to be naturalized, they'll send you across to this little city hall that'll tell you about all the city services that are available to you. So that co-location is really useful for reference. At University of Arizona, they just opened, this is an award winner from last year, the Student Success District, which includes 2 libraries, a gym, and all the student support services. And they found that students it's relatively early to determine like long-term impacts here, but they're finding that more students are using these resources when they have them all in the same space, and they can refer people to where they need to go. And the final examples I wanted to show, I mentioned that Sunset Park, the one that used the little storefront as a staging space to try out stuff. This just opened in November. This is their new building, which has, I think, 60 to 70 units of permanently affordable housing built on top of it. So co-locating affordable housing with libraries and building other social ecologies around it. Some examples of that. And then Andrew Berman is doing the same thing in Inwood. This is, I think, 174 units of permanently available, permanently affordable housing built on top of the library. And it's quite a magnificent space, too. So this is an example of thinking about multiple social services co-located and how they can support one another as part of a larger ecology. And Greenpoint is kind of like that too, thinking about environmental education and environmental activism and justice in relation to the library. So I will stop there, and thank you.
So normally, I would say, well, let's ask some questions, but we have a little time limit on this room, so I'm going to have you talk to Shannon out in the hall, right out here to the back. She'll be here for a little while so that she can answer your question personally there, and maybe if she talks loud enough, everyone can hear. But I want to thank everyone for coming, and thank you so much for your talk.
Thanks.